Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We are starting this morning with the second panel dealing with decision-making processes, or consultation processes, and the members of this panel are Mr. Peter Sakic, Mr. Brian Asu, and Mr. Jeff Young. So you know Mr. Asu, and he remains under oath, but Peter Sakic and Jeff Young do need to be sworn in.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Mr. Sakic?
Yes.
I affirm.
You state your name, please.
Peter Anton Sakic.
Jeffrey Young.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Mr. Asu's biography has already been marked as an exhibit in these proceedings, but I would like to go through the background of Mr. Sakic and Mr. Young. So I'll start with you, Mr. Sakic. You've provided us with a biography, and that's at tab 4 of the materials for this panel. Thank you. This outlines your involvement with fishing-related processes, Mr. Sakic. And I'll just run through them with you. Currently you're the co-chair of the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board.
Yes.
And you've been involved in the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum and are currently the chair of the Monitoring and Compliance Panel of that forum.
Yes.
And you've been a member of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee at the IHPC since 2004.
Yes.
You're also the president of the BC Wild Harvest Salmon Producers Association. I'll run through a bunch of these, and the Area H Harvest Committee. You're a member of the Area H Harvest Committee and president of the Gulf Trollers Association, as stated. Thank you.
That's right.
And you're a director of the Pacific Coast Fishermen's Mutual Marine Insurance Company and a member of the Harbor Authority Association.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll have that biography marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 422.
Thank you. And Mr. Young, you have a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science.
Yes.
And a Master's of Science in Forestry from UBC.
Correct.
And you have also done work studying the physiology of migrating salmon and causes of mortality under Scott Hinch.
Yes.
Your biography is at tab 2 of the materials before you, and that could be pulled up. Oh, I'm sorry. No, he's got that. You've also done work as an aquatic biologist and environmental scientist with Iqaluit Environmental and Geotechnical Incorporated.
Yes.
And you have been an aquatic biologist with David Suzuki Foundation from 2005 to the present.
Yes.
And you have been a representative for the Marine Conservation Caucus at both the IHPC and the Canadian Caucus of the Fraser River Panel.
Yes.
Your biography is on the screen, or your CV is on the screen, and that is the CV you provided that sets out the work that we've just reviewed, and plus other additional papers and work that you've done in your career.
Yes.
I'll have that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 423.
All right. My questions are, for the most part, going to be directed to all the panel members, but there may be times when I'm directing to just one person, and we've had a set of witnesses already talking about some of these issues. We've heard from Mr. Sato, Jerry Christensen, and also Pat Matthews. So we do have some familiarity with the processes we're going to be going through with you today, and I'm going to, as a result, try and not go through as much background on some of the formal setting up of the processes and get into your perspectives on how these processes are running. So you can expect that people in the room have heard about these processes already and they have some working knowledge of what we're talking about. Mr. Asu, we did hear previously about a recommendation from the Williams Committee that First Nations become fully engaged with the Fraser River Panel and DFO management. Do you think, right now, how many First Nation members are on the Fraser River Panel?
There's 2 First Nation members on the Fraser River Panel. The only thing I will say, just to add to that, is I think sometimes there's some confusion around my role on the Fraser River Panel. Even though I am First Nations, I am officially a commercial alternate.
Okay.
Originally it was to Larry Wick, and now it is to Chris Ashton.
Thank you. And with the 2 First Nations members that are there in that capacity as First Nations members, and of course, you're a First Nation person yourself, so you have your own perspectives to bring. But do you think that the current makeup of the Fraser River panel fully engages First Nations within the Fraser River panel consultative process?
As far as fully engaging, I guess it may not go all the way in meeting the needs of all of the different regions, for First Nations. But I think for the most part, as far as the representation is concerned, they have First Nations representatives for the lower and upper river. It's just really we don't have anybody officially from the marine area at the panel level, either as just simply a member of the panel or with respect to the technical committee.
Now, I wanted to move to the IHPC process now. The IHPC has been described at length already, and we have looked at the terms of reference of the IHPC, so I'm not asking this question for you to repeat what's in that terms of reference, but it's a bigger question. The question is, from your perspective, what is the purpose of the IHPC? Like, what is it contributing to the process from your perspective, or what you bring to it? And I'll start with you, Mr. Sakic, if I could.
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I listened to some of the stuff earlier today, and there is other parts of the IHPC that you don't hear about. Like, there is the Chinook Committee, which has a number of different people put on there, which will get its technical information and everything that it needs to be able to work with. And it's sort of broken up like that. They will come back to that room and look for a recommendation for consensus on what they have learned. It's just, I don't know how else you could run it. It has to be consensus. You basically, when we did put forward, again, different than earlier from the commercial industry about licensing thing, we got consensus on it there, and we did have a phone meeting with a person from Ottawa to follow up on that. So simple issues you can get consensus on, big ones you can't. But then I think with this the Chinook recovery thing coming up is going to be one of the first challenges around there, where there is a Chinook committee that will go away and work with the people, that will give them the technical information that they need, and they will bring that back to the table.
All right, well, let me ask the question in maybe a slightly different way, and again, focusing on Fraser River Sockeye. You're there as a representative of the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. Sorry, I get these names mixed up. You're there for the CSAB. What is your objective? Like, what information does your group hope to bring to those meetings, and what does your group hope to achieve at those meetings in relation to Fraser River Sockeye?
There's not really a whole lot you can do there. Fraser River Sockeye has a process all of its own. You may talk about the harvest rate sort of thing. You may have those discussions, but you have such a diverse group of people in that room. Some people are not even connected with some things, so it's sort of an odd place to take that sort of stuff.
Who are you talking about when you say some people aren't even connected to that?
Well, there's some people that are from the other end of the coast that are in there that aren't really much around the Fraser River Sockeye issues and all of the things that go on there. It's just a diverse group of people.
All right, and then does your organization hope to achieve anything through its participation at the IHPC?
Well, it seems to be interlinked with getting the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan together, and that is an important step in there. And just how else you would do it, I don't really know.
Okay, Mr. Young.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I asked what the purpose is of the IHPC, but it may be helpful to think about in terms of the questions I asked Mr. Sakic, which is, what does your group bring to the table, and what is your group hoping to achieve, or what does the objective for your group in a big picture sense? Are you trying to get consensus? Are you trying to resolve disputes? Is there some other process that you're engaging in there?
I think the Marine Conservation Caucus hopes to achieve or ensure that conservation is held up as the priority mandate for DFO. Functionally, that's consisted of ensuring the wild sound policy is being implemented. In terms of how the IHPC has functioned and what it's proven to provide, I would say generally information from DFO to participants, some information from other sectors that's useful. It provides a venue to provide some advice to DFO, and at times it provides the opportunity for some useful discussion between sectors.
Do you find it's an opportunity to resolve disputes between sectors?
Not exclusively. So what I mean by that is it can provide that opportunity. I don't think it's being used to serve that purpose in a very explicit way. So a lot of the time, disputes may not be dealt with there or attempted to be dealt with outside of that process.
So I should have asked that of you, Mr. Sakic, as well. Do you find that the IHPC is a place for different sectors to resolve disputes that are arising in overlapping fishing plans or?
No, it is very big on information. I can't say that there's not a lot of information supplied. I missed that earlier, but the sectors basically work that out in their own advisories. Don't really bring it in there. It's not a place to go and fight about fishing plans.
Okay. Mr. Asu?
Well, as far as our interest in attending the IHPC is really just to ensure that we end up with a coordinated fishing plan at the end of the day, and that any of the issues that are before us, it's given us an opportunity to at least address it at that level. And in particular, I'm talking about two issues that arise each and every season, and we'll never reach consensus at the table. We all go away and do our letter writing after the fact, and those two issues being the early summer run escapement level and where it's going to be set at, and also the Cultus Lake exploitation rate and what that allowable rate will be on an annual basis, because it's of course listed under SARA.
And this may have been answered partly already, but do you think the role of the IHPC is to actually reach a consensus that will be implemented by DFO, or is the role simply to advise DFO, who will then ultimately make decisions? And start with you, Mr. Asu.
I believe that it's more an advisory role than anything else as far as what we're doing there.
Okay, Mr. Young.
I agree. It's an advisory process.
Mr. Sakic.
Yes, information gathering and advisory.
As participants in that process, who needs to be at the table for the process to work effectively? Like, are the people that are there now the right people, or are there people missing who should be there? Are there more people there that need to be there? So I'll start with you, Mr. Sakic.
Well, I would sure like to see, I'm going to speak for our commercial sector, I would like to see their proper full participation there, because sometimes there's a couple missing and they miss out on things, and like I said, there's a lot of information there. So the sectors, or whoever you're representing, whatever groups you are, should have their full participation of people there.
Does the structure as it currently is prevent those people from coming, or is it that they just haven't showed up and they've been invited but they haven't showed up?
They just haven't showed up, I guess, feeling not too much happens there, whatever the case is, but they do miss a lot of things that they should know about when they're not there.
Mr. Young?
I think First Nations are underrepresented. However, given that it's an advisory process and not really functional as a decision-making process, I guess it's a little more open in terms of how important it is to have different representation. But generally, given the scope of impact of at least DFO's decisions that may or may not be reflected in the IFMP or discussed at the IHPC, First Nations are significantly affected by those, and representation of First Nations is I think, less than ideal.
Mr. Assu?
I guess I would, agree with Jeffrey's comments. But, having said that, I'm just not clear on who is officially actually requested a seat per se, and obviously notifying the department that they're underrepresented. But I guess the only other thing that I would add to that is right from the inception of the IHPC, I can remember the first meeting we ever had, and I think we must have had something like 75, 80 observers in the room. And I think because it was a new process, people weren't trusting in it. But what I've noticed is over time that that has gone by the wayside, and I think people are feeling a bit more comfort with the whole process.
What about from the DFO perspective? Does DFO bring the right people to those meetings for the advice that's being sought and also the information that's being given by DFO? Mr. Young?
For many of the topics discussed, I believe they bring the right people, the right experts to discuss those topics and to provide information. I think for certain issues related to decisions, there may be the right level of DFO person there to be able to adequately discuss the latitude around which they might consider different approaches or a different decision. But ultimately, with the decision-making authority generally being held quite high, and in many cases around the issues of greatest concern to those at the table, that being the minister's office, there isn't actually the decision-maker at the table able to have an interactive dialogue, I guess, with the participants in the IHPC.
All right, just do either Mr. Assu or Mr. Sakic have anything to add to that?
You couldn't possibly cover off all of the subjects that come up there. There's a pretty diverse group of people there. You have people from up in the Skeena, you've got them from Prince Rupert, Queen Charlotte Islands, you've got in the Fraser River, all over the place, and so everybody is looking at somewhat different sort of issues that pertain to them, and just to cover it all off there in a couple of days would near be impossible. And so that's why I say this Chinook committee that's going to be tasked with this recovery thing that's going to start up will be interesting, because they will have to report back to the table. That's the way I see it should run.
I guess in terms of DFO's involvement at the IHPC, there is a large contingent of DFO people at the IHPC. At times, I think there's more of them than there is us. So they do their best to make sure they have the appropriate people there for the most part.
And just on sort of stepping back, do you think that the IHPC and the process for providing input to the IFMP do allow stakeholders to give DFO meaningful input? I'll start with you, Mr. Assu.
Yeah, I guess, as far as what we can do, in terms of that process, we are allowed to try and advise them the best we can. But like I said earlier, there's a lot of subjects that we can't reach consensus on within the room, and I guess we all go away and we develop the letters and send them off to the appropriate people within the department at the end of the day, and they do receive a lot of advice for the IFMP by means of letter writing campaigns.
Mr. Young?
In terms of providing a venue to gather information and provide some advice back to the department, I think it's more useful, or it's useful to have it. It's better to have it than not. I think the process could be improved considerably, though. I think there's a couple of examples. One is, as we've heard, fishing plans for specific sectors or areas may be developed bilaterally, placed into a draft IFMP, and it can be difficult for other participants to identify and understand what's being proposed and be able to evaluate it in a way that's timely and useful, or timely in a way that allows us to provide useful input. Another point I'd make quickly is that it's my belief that conservation objectives are the first priority in terms of fisheries planning, and that if DFO was more clear about exactly what conservation objectives they were prioritizing and going to meet in a year, it would be a lot easier for us to evaluate, and participants, I think, to evaluate an IFMP or issues that come up at the IHPC more easily.
Can you give me an example of what you would be looking for?
I think the wild salmon policy provides a fairly clear direction in terms of defining conservation for the purposes of fisheries management. So, for example, identifying conservation units and limit and target reference points. Lower and upper benchmarks for each conservation unit. And for example, if we have identified conservation units that are in the red zone, specific conservation planning needs to be undertaken, and knowing that that's the policy and that's the requirement of DFO for fisheries planning, I think it would be a lot more effective kind of framework for participants to discuss how we best meet those objectives.
Conservation goals are set out in the draft IFMP, are they not, in terms of proposals for certain stocks at risk?
I think over time there's been improvement in listing some conservation objectives. I would suggest that that's partly due to our input. We've actually been requesting that information at the conservation unit level and objectives at the conservation unit level be included. They have started including some conservation objectives. Some of them are relatively clear, some of them are very general, which makes it difficult to measure whether they're being met. I don't think they're laid out in a comprehensive way that you could suggest is consistent with meeting the full conservation requirements of the wild salmon policy.
Mr. Sakic, does the IHPC and the development of the IFMP, that process, does it provide for meaningful input from stakeholders?
Well, the IFMP is basically put together before it goes in there. All the various groups, sectors, whomever you are, you work at it. And it is in a draft form. And basically the place is to somewhat sign off on it. That's about all you can do with it. But the problem is that if you were able to remove all of the other issues out of that room that muddy the waters whenever you try and do this work, it might succeed a little better.
Can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
Well, you shouldn't have allocation issues in there. You shouldn't be having political scraps over the fish in there. These things develop because you have such a diverse group of people in there. So if those things were removed outside of there and you actually narrowed that down to probably what it was invented for, you'd do a lot better.
And what would that narrow scope be that you think would be workable?
I think being able to accept each other's way of you're going to handle your fishing plans.
So just reviewing the fishing plans as they've been developed in bilateral meetings.
They've been developed in other meetings and then brought in a draft form. But if you look at a 2-day meeting and some of the things that take place there, I mean, it wanders. It has to, because it's such a diverse group of people. So if you got those other things out of there and stayed with what you'd brought in your draft form and okayed it for each other, then you could say it is the sign-off place for the IFMP.
The stakeholders are provided with a lot of technical information at those meetings and in the development of the fishing plans for the groups, including outputs from the Frizzy model and other technical information. do stakeholders and do First Nations, from your perspective, have the technical and the human resource capacity, the technical capacity, and even the financial capacity to understand those issues and provide meaningful input during this advisory process? I'll start with you, Mr. Sakic.
Well, some of it's so complicated, I'm going to be very honest with you. Most of it goes over the top of my head because I'm not I haven't been trained in reading models and doing all sorts of things. So some of it gets very complex, and I get I get a good look at it around the Fraser panel. So if you're to start bringing that stuff in the room, and it's not just about providing the technical expertise. First of all, I guess you better go and learn how it all runs, even before you attempt to go to that level.
Mr. Christensen, when he was here, said that he felt that the role of DFO was to provide neutral, unbiased scientific advice to all the stakeholders. And that he didn't see a need for stakeholder groups to have their own technical advisors. What do you think about that proposition?
Well, they have technical advisors in other processes. If you want to go around the Fraser panel, there's technical advisors there. Like I said, this Chinook committee is going to be interesting because they're going to have technical advice, but it's not going to be done in that room. They will come back to that room on how they feel about how things are being done. But you turn technical advice loose in that room, you're going to be there 365 days.
Well, so do you think that DFO should be the one providing the technical advice and explaining it to the stakeholders, or should the stakeholders be bringing their own technical advisors in and having those sorts of debates at a
I think
level?
that the information, and I'm going to go along with Brian on this one, the amount of information we're supplied from Fisheries and Oceans is very substantial, and it's, for the most part, understandable. It doesn't get too technical because you have to be able to have the people in that room be able to understand it. Mm-hmm. You wanted to get right into that stuff, everybody's head would swim.
Right. So do you, from your perspective then, is the information provided adequately for you to understand what's being presented and make or give the advice that you're being asked to give? Like, do you feel like, you said initially when you started off, sometimes it's so complicated it goes over your head. Like, is it so complex that you can't actually provide the advice they're looking for, or do they explain it in a way
No,
that
I
it's
think I jumped
understandable?
ahead of myself there. It's not so much there, it's in some of the other places. I think the advice we're getting there, is adequate for what you're doing.
Okay. Mr. Young?
I think DFO has a responsibility to provide objective scientific information, and more than that, a responsibility to identify how it may affect their conservation objectives or their mandate as clearly as they can. I do think there's issues with how clearly they're presenting that information. I think it could be done better given the audience. In terms of whether stakeholders have an adequate technical support to participate, putting aside that first issue, it's difficult for me to say exactly. The Marine Conservation Caucus, all of our current members each have advanced graduate level training in either fishery science or ecology, so I think we feel adequately able to participate. But in so much as any other participants, or us as well, identify that problem of technical understanding or technical capacity, I do think that's an issue that should be addressed. I'm not sure by what means it's best.
Mr. Asu?
Yeah, I heard Jerry's recommendation there this morning, and actually kind of tend to agree that at the IHPC level, that's probably not a bad idea. But you know, having said that, it definitely has to be neutral, unbiased as far as the department is concerned, because I've noticed in the past that is not always that. You know, it's not always that case.
Right. Well, you'll recall Mr. Rosenblum asked some questions of Mr. Christensen about whether he felt that DFO was funded adequately to meet that obligation to provide the advice required, the scientific advice required in a comprehensive and neutral way. And Mr. Christensen expressed some concerns with that. Have you got any concerns in that respect?
I would probably just have to agree with what with what was said earlier, that there has been a lot of what I've noticed cutbacks over time, and there's very few people that can actually participate in everything that they're being asked to do.
Thank you. Well, that leads into my next question, which is, we talked about the technical issues, what about the human resources? Like, do we have too many processes and not enough people, or is it at a good level? Start with you, Mr. Asu.
We do have a lot of processes, and I guess I'd have to say probably all the processes we have that exist today probably all serve a purpose. You're absolutely correct in that, in terms of especially whether it be commercial or First Nations representation at any of these processes, it becomes very difficult because people start relying on the same individual to attend all of the different processes. And I guess, sometimes it's for some consistency, with respect to the fishery.
Thank you. Mr. Young, I wonder if you could address those two questions I just raised with Mr. Asu. One is the funding adequacy, that from your perspective, or how you've seen DFO being able to meet its obligations, and then also the human resource adequacy issue. Is there enough people to do all the meetings and processes that are being put forward by the department?
I think there is a lack of capacity and effort on DFO's part put into some of the basic requirements for managing the fishery. That would include escapement monitoring and some other science. I think that, and we need to improve that, particularly consistent with the wild salmon policy. I think with that information and better clarity from DFO on the conservation objectives and the requirements of the wild salmon policy, the wild salmon policy actually lays out exactly how information would be presented in actually a fairly clear format. And with that, I think that the efficiency actually of these processes could be improved quite significantly, because we'd have a better understanding of what we're trying to manage for, and not just discussing or arguing about what that might be. In terms of participation, well, firstly, I think my primary input on that is that I think the efficiency of these processes could be improved through that, which might address that issue in and of itself. But I do think that there is a large number of processes. It definitely is difficult for the Marine Conservation Caucus to participate fully in all of them. But I do think DFO themselves actually do put a fair amount of resources into the processes themselves.
All right, Mr. Sakic.
Well, process is a pretty big word. I don't know which ones would go. I mean, they're just, which ones are you thinking of that, you?
We've heard about the different meetings that DFO holds with different sectors individually. We've heard about the IHPC. We have heard about the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum. There's the Fraser River Panel. There's technical committees. There's a number of, and I know that that's not even close to all of them, but there's a lot of, we've certainly heard of many different consultations that the department is involved with, and we do see the same names come up over and over again. So my question is not necessarily critical of that. I'm just wondering if, from your sector's perspective, are you feeling burnout? Is there too many processes? Should they be consolidated, or are they unique to different purposes and it's manageable?
I think they're unique to different purposes.
And is it manageable for your sector to meet the obligations that are being put on you to participate?
We managed to get into the mandatory ones. Don't forget the Salmon Dialogue Forum is volunteer. It's exactly what it says. It is a dialogue forum. It's interesting. We managed to get people at the IHPC, and in the other stuff I'm involved in, we managed to get them there.
Okay. The IHPC is focused, at least in the spring period, it's focused on the development of the IHPC. I'm not going to take you to these recommendations. We have done this earlier in the hearings, but there were recommendations made in 2001 from the Institute for Dispute Resolution, and then from Mr. Shamoot in 2003, that there be a policy advisory committee and a public forum for discussion of policy issues amongst all sectors, that kind of a forum should be developed. And the information we've received from DFO in this inquiry is that the IHPC is the process that they see as is the process where these policy issues are being discussed. Do you agree with that? Is the IHPC currently being used for policy discussions, and is it appropriate to use the IHPC for policy discussions at all? I'll start with you, Mr. Sakic.
I don't think you can do it there.
Is there a place where, is there an attempt to do it at the IHPC now, or is that being done somewhere else?
Well, policy's a pretty big thing, you know. Just you're not going to jump into that forum and get consensus on it if that's what you're looking for.
Right. Is there another? Well, let me just leave it with that and ask you, Mr. Young. Is IHPC the place for a policy debate?
I would say no, and I would actually go so far as to say that my recollection is that we've explicitly avoided doing that, or at least I recall times when it's been suggested that a discussion point may have been around policy and that it was something that shouldn't be discussed fully at the IHPC. I don't think that it is the appropriate place for policy discussions, particularly in so much as policy often will deal with and affect a different range and often a broader range of stakeholders than may be represented by the HPC. And so I think for whatever policy is being discussed, it would have to be adequately, whatever process that was, adequately ensure representation by those affected.
Right. Would a policy forum alleviate some of the difficulties that you expressed earlier within the IHPC, where you said the objectives aren't clear? It's not really clear what people are trying to achieve, so it wastes time at the IHPC. Would a policy forum help move that process along?
No, the issues that I was raising was really about kind of the fundamental scientific basis of the wild salmon policy and identifying how DFO is going to meet its priority mandate around conservation. And I think defining conservation is primarily a technical scientific question, but then how we go about meeting those objectives may involve different participants. And I actually think as it relates to harvest, the IHPC might be an appropriate place for that to happen.
Okay. Mr. Asu?
I would agree with what's been said, that the policy forum in itself would probably should be separate from the IHPC, and that they shouldn't be together.
We've heard that the province has an ex officio role at the IHPC. What is the role of the province from your perspective at the IHPC? What does it contribute to the discussion, and what's its role? Mr. Asu?
Well, I guess really, to be quite candid, I don't really know exactly what their official role is in terms of the IHPC. I know they've been participating there, for a long time, but what their specific role is, it's never been clear to me.
Not clear to me either. I could see a role for the province in raising concerns around how harvest planning could intersect with some of their responsibility, for example, around management of steelhead or sturgeon. And at times I do think those issues have come up from the provincial representation, but overall I'm not fully aware of what their role is.
Mr. Sakic?
I think the province has a role in it for the fact that they have a fisheries department. They're partners with the federal government in a lot of this stuff. They have their interests to be represented, and as Jeff says, when it gets into some of the freshwater stuff, that's where they actually have jurisdiction.
Okay. With the IFMP, we've heard from other witnesses how the drafts are presented and at the different meetings that they're presented for the draft IFMP. So I'm not going to go over that with you, but I do have a question about this. Has there ever been, you've talked about how it's difficult to reach consensus at the IHPC. Has there ever been instances where there was consensus at the IHPC that was not later taken up in the final IFMP? as approved by the minister? Mr. Sakic?
I couldn't answer that. It's just, there's so much of it. You know, it just, it's huge. IFMP is like a phone book now.
Okay. Mr. Young, have you got any response to that?
I think both in terms of providing advice through independent participants or as consensus. It's always seemed to me to be in an advisory way, and so I've never really had this expectation that a consensus motion, as they've generally been put forward, is going to be taken as anything particularly different than advice, other than having some weight behind it. I am aware of the one where people agreed to a motion around a license fee holiday, although I'm not really certain if that is the type of decision that people had envisioned we'd come to through consensus or not. In terms of function, as I've said, I think the IHPC has more been about advice.
All right. Well, let me ask it maybe a different way before I come to you, Mr. Estu, because I probably can ask it in a better way. Is it clear to you as participants in this process how the discussion that you've had with the department through the bilateral meetings and through the intersectoral discussions at the IHPC, how that advice and input you've given to the department finds its way into the final IFMP and the final decision is made on the IFMP? Is that final sort of thread from meetings and discussions through to the finalization of the IFMP clear and transparent to stakeholders? And I'll start with you, Mr. Asous.
I guess really not absolutely clear on how some of that advice at the end of the day is arrived at. You know, like I said earlier, I do know, you know, just with the two issues that I'd spoke of, I think 6 years running now, our organization has had to provide letters to DFO on the early summer, you know, escapement, and of course the exploitation rate for cultists. And it isn't absolutely clear to me how they arrive at their final decision and with what they end up entering into there.
Mr. Young?
Yeah, it's not clear to me either, and I share that perspective on those issues for the examples of the early summer harvest rate and the cultist sockeye exploitation rate. I'll add two other examples. One is I am aware, or believe at least, that some sectors have been involved in drafting fishing plans or portions of a fishing plan that then end up in the IFMP. So for those sectors, those interests, I think that is fairly transparent to them at least. But I'm also aware of examples where we've requested certain changes to the IFMP, particularly around identifying conservation objectives for conservation units, and I've known that hasn't resulted in a change in the IFMP, and I don't know by what process that decision was made.
Thank you. Mr. Sakic?
I just don't think you could make those sort of decisions in there, not in 3 days out of a year.
But is it clear to you, once all the information's been provided through the different meetings that are held and the different consultations that DFO may have with your sector, and then at these intersectoral meetings, how all that information gets synthesized and decisions are made as to what actually finds its way into the final IFMP? Is that clear from your perspective?
If you were to go through all of the things in the IFMP, you would be there a lot longer than a day. So I think they agree to agree sort of thing. But if you wanted to take it all apart, you would be working at it a long time.
Right. Are you satisfied then with the process from your sector's perspective?
Once you clean it up a little bit. For instance, as one just mentioned here, the license holiday thing, it had no business being in there. I remember that distinctly. We met the day before that with the CSAB, and he said, "You're taking this in there." I said, "You sure that's the right place?" And they insisted, so that's how it got there. But it shouldn't even be there.
Okay.
That should have been dealt with in our own place. We didn't need consensus for that.
Right. Moving from the pre-season planning process, which is most of what is happening at the IHPC level, and into the in-season decision-making timeframe, can the IFMP, in your view, adequately address all of the in-season decision-making that's required, and particularly where the in-season results turn out to be quite different from what anyone had anticipated pre-season. So can the IFMP as drafted adequately cover all the contingencies that may arise, or should there be, how do you deal with in-season decisions that may need to be made outside of the IFMP because situations have changed or the run's radically bigger or radically smaller than anticipated, or any other circumstance that may arise in season? Mr. Sakic?
I think you want to be careful in a lot of different ways with that IFMP, that you lock yourself into things whether they would be beneficial or not beneficial, or even wrong in some cases. And I'm just not talking run size here. There's all sorts of things in there that a situation may arise during the particular year when you think it should have a change for some reason, but no, it's in the IFMP. That way, it's not so good.
You think there should be more flexibility for in-season decision makers?
Yes, and this you keep in mind, the in-season decision stuff can go both ways.
Meaning what?
Well, you could gain opportunities or you could lose opportunities. It's not fixed in any one spot, as that's how it should be. It seems to be easy to go down, but very hard to go up. So in some ways, once it's in there, it is totally unflexible.
And that, from your perspective, is a problem?
That is a problem.
And Mr. Young?
I do think the IFMP should very clearly identify the objectives for the fishing plan, so the conservation objectives, as well as the allocation objectives, which would include the prioritization and meeting the prioritization within allocation. I think it is appropriate to have an in-season process, firstly, to ensure that we're relying on in-season information to meet those objectives, but also to identify and deal with scenarios where, given conditions in the water, what we had assumed might be the best way to meet those objectives might need to change. But ultimately, that the objectives themselves should be well defined and well understood by everyone. Further, I think the IFMP can include a decision-making framework or decision rules that should largely be unchangeable, except in extreme circumstances where it's clearly running into one of those clearly stated objectives.
So from your perspective, is the IFMP as it's currently drafted meeting that goal? Does it have decision rules that are adequate for changing in-season environments?
No, I think it lacks particularly clear conservation objectives, and I think it could be improved in terms of identifying both allocation objectives and proposed decision rules.
Mr. Assu?
No, I don't believe that the IFMP can ever cover every circumstance that may arise from time to time, and that as far as the in-season management of the fisheries go, there has to be more flexibility in trying to make changes if need be. Peter nailed it. It could either be one way or the other, to the good or to the detriment of your fishery, but you need that flexibility. And I guess in terms of what I believe in as flexibility is within region here, that's where the decision, I think, has to be made as far as in-season, rather than having to get to ministerial authority to make changes to the IFMP within the season.
This last year, 2010, a decision was made to go to the minister for approval of an alteration to the fishing plans. Did you find that was ineffective in some way?
You know what? Up until this morning, I wasn't even aware that was done. So.
If you've already given me your evidence on this, then we'll move on, but I just wanted to make sure I covered off whether you had any ideas as to how in-season decision-making should be done if it's outside the IFMP or the parameters set by the IFMP as currently drafted. Mr. Sakic?
Could you give that to me again?
Yeah, if you say the IFMP shouldn't be strict. There should be some flexibility for in-season decision makers. How do you say that the in-season decision makers should make those decisions? Should there be intersectoral process before changes are made? Should it go back to the minister? Should it be some other process? Like how do you think it should be best managed in season?
I think you need a level of flexibility that's going to be science driven. That's just not going to be throwing the dart at the wall while you'd make a change.
So you would expect that science advisors should be making recommendations for changes, and then who would ultimately make the decision? Would it be at the Fraser River panel level or some other level?
Well, all I know is the change that took place last summer was I guess it was a recommendation of the minister, probably, I assume. And it must have come out of science, managers of science, the whole suite of DFO around the Fraser issues.
Was it adequate? Last year's change in the plan, was that adequate from your perspective?
I think so.
Okay. Do you thought it was sufficient for it to have recommendation to go to the minister? You don't agree with Mr. Asu that it should be done in the region?
Well, I guess if it could be, it would streamline it, basically, but as long as you can get the same results in the end, because you have to look at the other side of the coin here, too. Not that many years ago, I think we let about 20 million fish go through or 18 million or something, because of a couple of stock specific that year that were down. So the whole run went. So there is decisions made. The decision was made to leave it like that because of that. This year there was a decision made to increase the harvest rate because of the amount of surplus.
Mm-hmm. So was the process in 2010 adequate from your perspective?
I guess the process had identified some issues that had to be dealt with.
Right, and was it resolved in a way that was satisfactory from your perspective?
Well, nobody liked it. That's a lot of fish going by the doorstep.
In 2010?
I can't remember. Brian may be able to recall a year. It's got to be 5 years ago or so.
No, I was asking about whether the 2010 decision to change the fishing plan by going up to the minister for approval on a change was an adequate process from your perspective.
It was adequate if you had to go to the minister to do it. That was the only discussion that there was earlier.
Yeah.
The process of doing it was adequate to be done.
Okay. Mr. Young?
I think that if the IFMP is really clear with its objectives and decision rules, it would limit the amount of necessary in-season decision-making around those rules. I think that, going to the example you used, I think that was an inadequate process. I think both that the level of decision was made, the type of decision that was made was in contravention potentially with a conservation objective and a decision rule within the IFMP, and so I also don't think necessarily that the advisory process around that was necessarily either transparent or adequately considered those issues.
Mr. Commissioner, it's 12:30, so I wonder if we should take the break.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.